Welcome to the latest edition of the Mind-Gut Conversation, the interview series about topics related to health of the gut, the brain, and the environment. Today, I have the great pleasure to talk to two researchers from the Irving Barber School of Arts and Sciences of UBC, the Okanagan campus of the University of British Columbia. Dr. Gibson and Dr. Ghosh are a husband and wife research team who share some of the same research interests related to the topic of dietary fat, even though they pursue this in different settings and disease areas. Dr. Ghosh is a member of the Institute for Healthy Living and Chronic Disease Prevention at UBC and has a long-standing interest in biochemical aspects of dietary fats and exercise in preventing metabolic disease and obesity. So I'll start the interview with you, Dr. Ghosh, and let me start with a general question. If one follows the dramatic changes in dietary recommendations issued by the US Department of Agriculture and the Canadian government, in particular in terms of dietary fat consumption, one wonders how much of these recommendations are really based on well-designed clinical studies as opposed to less evidence-based trends and opinions. The current dogma seems to be that fat intake is good for you. Could you expand a little bit on that, situation?
So the situation is, you just mentioned North America, right? So North America, I'm not considering at this point Mexico, because I'm not aware of their guidelines. But Canadian and American guidelines, I'm quite aware of. However, I'll just tell it right off the bat, much of the recommendation that we have is not based on evidence. The easiest way to look at it is to look at European guidelines, right? All the countries of Europe, especially Sweden, Netherlands, etc. They have completely different set of guidelines. And this is what I say to my students, is that whenever you are looking at food guidelines, food is big business. When we're looking at food guidelines, everybody in the world, all English speaking nations, most, as you know, the language of science is English. Everybody reads the same articles. Everybody reads the same papers. Everybody looks at the same evidence. So how come Sweden right now, the guideline of Sweden and probably Norway as well, Sweden especially, Karolinska Institute has issued a guideline over 5 years back saying that high fat diet is the way to go to reduce obesity and everything else. It is contradictory to what the North American guidelines are saying us. I just went a couple of years back to Netherlands, and they have a huge emphasis on dairy fat. So high fat dairy, high fat yogurt, etc. To bring it in a nutshell, I'll just tell you one thing. Both Sweden and Holland are not big producers of corn, soy, etc., etc. Their countries' lobbies and their countries' politicians listen to the big dairy lobby, right? And in North America, as you know, we have big soybean lobby, we have big corn oil lobby. So basically, based on which lobby you are following and which lobby has the highest hold on the government, the food guidelines are written accordingly. It's as simple as that. However, much of the guidelines is not based on evidence.
Yeah, it's kind of remarkable because obviously millions of people are in some ways looking at these guidelines as sort of the most objective evidence that they can find that helps them to maneuver a fairly difficult terrain now of diet books and recommendations for a healthy diet. So it's interesting to hear you say that, how much that is influenced from non-scientific influences.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So there are a large number of studies, as you know, that performed in laboratory mice that have consistently demonstrated negative effects of a high-fat diet. I guess it consists of about 60% lard in these mice.
Yes.
On the cardiovascular system and on the brain. Are these studies translatable to humans?
Absolutely. Very good question. Thank you for asking this question. This I keep on writing in my papers, and I have written there are 2 papers out of there. So the biggest company that produces these lard-based diets, or the biggest company, which is, I think it is, the number is 6492 or 6692, whatever is the catalog number. It is made by a company called Research Diets. Okay. Research Diets is a big company in US that has been supplying or making these lard-based diets, right? Couple of years back, they published an online article. If you go online, I can send you a link. It is still online on their website where they apologized on something. So what is the apology for? See, lard is got from pigs. In the 1980s, when pigs were fed all kinds of food, the saturated fat level in the lard was predominant. When I tell you about lard, you think about saturated fat, I think about saturated fat, and everybody else thinks about saturated fat. However, over the last 10 years, they have been using cornmeal and corn byproducts to feed these pigs. Right now, all the high fat, and again, one thing to note is that all the laboratories that do this high fat feeding of lard to mice or rats, they do not analyze the fatty acid content of lard. What I'm trying to say is that by feeding cornmeal and corn oil, etc., to these pigs, right now it is available on the Research Diet website. The PUFA, or the polyunsaturated fatty acid to saturated fatty acids, is around 50-50. In some cases, the PUFA content of lard is actually higher than saturated fat acids. So now let me ask you a question. Now, if feeding lard is giving these bad results, I completely believe those results. Okay, so I am not debating about those results, but assigning them to saturated fats effect is completely erroneous because the diet composition have changed. Nobody does gas chromatographic analysis or real analysis of these fats. They just take it down from the website of the company. What they say is right now the composition and publish it in the paper, which is perfectly acceptable. However, the company themselves are saying right now, I will send you the link, that their PUFA content has increased over the last 10-20 years by almost 3 to 4 fold. So whatever effects you are seeing in the mice are probably because of lard. Number one. Number two, you said 60% fat diet. The highest, one of the highest consumption of fat by energy percentage is probably in France and in some other countries, which never exceeds 40 to 45%. Give you an example. I'll tell you, you will tell me, as an example, Tylenol is good for you or whatever. When you have fever, you can take Tylenol, it will go away. Now I give you a bottle of Tylenol and I tell you, eat the whole thing. You will be sick. Olive oil is good for you. Everybody knows that. I tell you to drink 60% of your diet as olive oil. You will feel sick because you simply do not have the amount of enzymes, the bile and all these things to digest all these things properly. Some of these, your liver cannot handle so much lipids, as an example, when they get absorbed and form chylomicrons and goes to the liver. So it is completely failure. So this is, first of all, an artificial diet. Mice, the normal fat that mice eats, again, mice is an omnivorous animal, or mice are omnivorous animals, and their normal fat percentage in their diet never exceeds 12 to 15%. 12% to 15% is a normal mouse diet. So if you multiply that by 5-fold, so I'm telling you, take any oil, any macronutrient in the world, in 5-fold concentration, you will have toxic effects. So not only is lard not a source of saturated fat, but right now is as good of a source of PUFA. And number two, the diet that people use in the lab to make the mice obese fast. I'm a mouse researcher, I can tell you that. We try to feed as much fat as you can so that we don't have to pay the housing costs of the mouse, make them fat, etc., and do the experiment. Well, that is not a normal diet.
So if I understand you correctly, this also means that the nature of the fat and the ratio of polyunsaturated to monounsaturated to saturated fats depends a lot on the diet of the animal.
Absolutely. I actually published a paper last year where I compared the butter, because again, everybody thinks butter is a source of saturated fat. Butter from all over the world. I think I analyzed 15 countries. US and Canada had the highest amount of PUFA, and Israel, of course, because Israel's cattle feed is essentially got from US through corn, right? You know, Israel is in the middle of a desert. They don't have grass, nor do they have big cornfields. So the highest amount of these polyunsaturated fats was in Israel, which looked basically like corn oil, like their butter looks like corn oil. And also US had one of the highest amounts of PUFA, and Canada's had also the highest amount of one. So those two were very comparable because we feed our animals similar products. So, and Israel and every other country from Russia, France, Germany, Japan, everybody had lower PUFA content.
That's really interesting. So one of my personal experiences has been, so I've grown up in southern Germany, and we used to hike up these mountains, and one habit in the Alps is that cows are taking up into the mountains over the summer, and they eat all this these mountain flowers and all this. So what impact would that have? Does it make a difference if I eat butter or milk from cows that live in that environment and eat that kind of food, as opposed to cows that are in feedlots in the US or dairy farms?
There is not even a question on this. I already analyzed these and I published a paper. I mean, just give you an example, the normal commercial butter, which is like, the cheap butter, as I say, in France is as good as any organic butter from any part of the world. And I am guessing their dairy practices, just by looking at the chemical composition of the butter, is vastly different. Now, the excuse that I hear in Canada and from other dairy farmers is that we are in a cold zone, we don't have grass year round, etc., etc. But if you look at Russia, which is in the same latitude as we are, their butter is vastly superior. And also there are certain organic farms in Canada and US who are actually making good quality butter with good omega-3 to omega-6 ratios and good saturated fats. So it is doable. Whether it is as profitable as not is a different story, right?
So this is a really interesting concept, because in these diet wars, people say fat is good or bad. So a big determinant is really how these foods are being produced. So you can have
absolutely 100%. I actually saw in TV that day, I'll just give you, it's a little bit sidebar, but I will understand. There was a documentary on an US farmer who has been growing turkey for last 100 years. Their family is like turkey farmers, right? And they have a line of original turkeys. These turkeys were flying up on trees. Okay. So we were like, I've never seen or think of the turkey flying up on the trees. So he was explaining that in the mid 1950s or 1960s, a genetic mutation appeared in turkeys, which is called the OB or the obese gene, right? So these turkeys became fat very fast and didn't have as much lean meat, etc., etc. So the commercial farmers understood the benefit of this gene and they propagated that line. So essentially, whatever turkeys you are buying right now are from that mutation, that gene, which makes the turkeys fat and all. So again, going back, right? Original food that we always had was like from turkey to chicken. I can go on and on. I don't think we have that much time, because this has been my passion of my work for the last 20 years since I came to Canada. I am interested in food because I have seen my country get devastated. Why I'm saying devastated, you may be hearing, right? India has become industrialized and we have all these industrialized countries' problems. Trust me, when I grew up, everybody cooked in palm oil. Everybody cooked in our traditional oils full of saturated fat. No problem was there. Now we have diabetes in every corner. Every second Southeast Asian has diabetes. You know that And I know that, right? So why did this thing happen? So this has been driving, and I see the same thing in Canada and the US. Anyways, going back, so absolutely how the food is produced, from where the food is coming, whether the genetic mutations are involved, are these the original birds? Like if you see a wild turkey and a farm turkey, they don't even look the same species. So what will I say?
So you mentioned this increase really worldwide, but so with some delay in the developing world of metabolic syndrome, metabolic diseases, and what role do you think that the fat per se had in this? Because now the whole discussion in the US is it's nothing to do with fat; it's all the carbohydrates that have triggered that. I mean, being an expert on dietary fats, what do you think the role of fat has been in this development?
Okay. The fat phobia started in the US in the 60s, as you know, from, these early 7-country study. There has been a fat phobia. You see, when people start, okay, so energy comes from only 3 ingredients: proteins, fats, carbohydrates. The moment you remove fat, you have to replace it with some other macronutrient. So there are 2 macronutrients. One is protein and one is carbohydrate. Protein we cannot digest beyond 20-25%. Doesn't matter who the person is. The simple reason for that is you need pepsin in your gut to first break down the main protein to polypeptides, and the polypeptides can be handled. So if you take too much protein, your pepsin is not sufficient to break all that protein down. Like so that's one of the fallacies and myths that more protein, no, it doesn't work that way. So 20-25. So now we are remaining with carbohydrates. The moment fat phobia came, all these breakfast cereals and all these high carb things came into the market. And if you follow, you simply have to follow the food disappearance data, and every country has that, like, they put the food and how it is getting sold from the stores will give you an idea. If you plot the rise of obesity, children's obesity and human obesity and metabolic syndrome with the appearance of high carbohydrate in our cereals and breakfasts and all, like the egg, bacon gone, right? So if you do that, it's almost like parallel correlation, right? So again, people will then argue, oh, there are other things that happen, people stopped exercising and all. But I think this carbohydrate is rightly being demonized. So then if you don't want to take carbohydrates, what do you take? Well, if you remove carbohydrates, you've got 2 other things, fats and proteins. Protein is constant. You have to increase fatty food intake. And one of the other things that most people forget is amino acid. Taking amino acid and carbohydrate and glucose stimulates insulin release. You know, and I know, one of the main things about insulin resistance is like any other resistance is like, if you are triggering the beta cell 6 times a day, 5 times a day to release insulin, it slowly becomes resistant to the stimulus. It's like, normal biochemical feature of anything, from drugs to anything, right? You get tolerance. So what happens is, if you take high fat diet or at least high fat breakfast, then your insulin is not stimulated because fat does not release insulin. So if fat does not release insulin, then your beta cell is protected from further stimulation to release insulin all the time. However, if you don't do that, like our current diet, what we have is my kids, right? Most kids wake up, have a drink of juice, boom, insulin release. After 1 hour, juice will not keep them happy. Then have another cereal, boom, another insulin release. When you have easily digestible carbohydrate, like simple sugars, in 2-3 hours, you'll be having a snack, a muffin, boom, another insulin release. So if you keep on doing that, it is pretty basic biochemistry that your thing will one day say, you know what, I'm not getting out. I don't care what you eat. So when it doesn't get out, then your blood sugar stays high in your blood, and you develop insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes overall.
So based on your research, unfortunately we have limited time.
Please,
based on your research, what would you recommend? Or it seems like you're not recommending it to your own children, but what would you recommend if you had to give a talk about, counteracting or preventing this epidemic of metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes and all these with their complications?
Absolutely, absolutely. I have seen with my own experiment with my kids and all, eggs. We don't eat enough eggs. Eggs is, one egg is 70 calories. It is full of protein. The entire egg white is essentially protein. And the inside there is good fats, DHA, which is omega-3, and a lot of saturated fat. Plus it has choline and other important materials that we don't get. 2 eggs, 70 calories, 140, 150 calories, you'll be full for half a day until noon. So you know what I mean? And I'm not in favor of processed meat, so I will not support bacon, but bacon is probably 100-fold better than having a bowl of Kellogg's cereal. So things like that, right? Which is full, natural, and highly dense and a little bit higher in fat. So if you want to take a toast, put a good amount of butter on it, eat it, and you should be full for longer time instead of putting jam on your butter, which will not keep you full for a long time. So thinking about what kind of food you are eating, energy dense, will keep you full. And I think that will prevent, at least basically trying to say is just go back to the basics, what people used to do 50, 60 years back.
I mean, that's true about the Mediterranean diet as well. So when these first 7-country studies was done in the 50s and 60s, I mean, the food in Italy was totally different from what it is today. And the same is very true about Asian countries.
Absolutely.
So it doesn't really matter so much what the individual diet is. It's really what we have done to these traditional diets to make them commercially.
Oh, it's terrible. Yeah. It's terrible. The moment you think about food as a commodity and your drive is to get the most by using the least, this is the problem. Right now we have salmon, right? We used to think fish is good for you, omega-3, omega-6, right? Like we used to get omega-3, DHA and EPA from fish. Right now, farmed salmon has almost an equal level of omega-6 to omega-3. Omega-6 didn't used to exist because the fish used to eat plankton and all, get all omega-3, then convert it in their bodies and all. Now you do farmed fish, you throw them corn pellets, right? So again, omega-6 and omega-3 are essential fatty acids. They have to be supplied from outside. But when you do supply, whatever you are supplying to your animals, whether it is cow or fish, it doesn't matter. The omega-6 will accumulate and you have this huge epidemic. So even right now, eating fish is not as beneficial. So this is the problem.
So the same thing that we talked about earlier in terms of butter and milk, it's the same is true about fish.
Same story.
It's not so much the animal, it's really what you feed that animal.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's really, one last question. As you know, so the Mediterranean diet has gotten a lot of positive press. There's many studies going on now, all the way from prevention of cognitive decline to gut health and all this. So how do you assess that from your own viewpoint? It is a diet that has relatively high amount of plant-based oil, so the olive oil.
Absolutely, sir. Thank you for asking me. I have done research on dietary fats on various models. I have never seen anything as beneficial as olive oil, full stop. However, there are a couple of tricks in there. One trick is the olive oil that you get in North America, you can just Google it, is 70% to 80% adulterated. Okay. So what they do is they get some, they mix it up with corn oil, and the food labeling guidelines, unfortunately in Canada, is such that they can still call it olive oil as long as it has a certain percentage and above. So it doesn't have to be 100%. Okay. The food labeling guideline says that you can call it olive oil based, whatever, even if it has like, I don't know, 5% or 10% or 20%, rest can be whatever. So getting a good source of olive oil is very hard and very, I mean, unless you chemically determine it, basically there is no other way, right? So that is, but going back to your main question, olive oil is the most beneficial. And absolutely, I have never seen in anything from gut health to heart health to brain health, anything as beneficial as olive oil. However, please, I see that you said plant-based oil. Don't say plant-based oil, please. Please say olive oil. Again, these are some of the things that people use in North America, because North America is not a big producer of olive oil. So even though we get the evidence, we try to equate plant-based oil, not animal. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's messing up the issue. So, you know, corn is as good as olive, sunflower is as good as olive. No, olive oil. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ghosh. This was really interesting. Could talk to you for a long time.
Yes, I can talk the whole day.
Yeah.